spring of 1989, at a municipal equipment auction in Hartley Falls, Ontario, a 38-year-old woman named Dorothy Crane paid $180 for a commercial bread oven with no heating elements, not a broken element, not a burnt-out element, no elements at all. Someone had stripped the entire electrical guts out years before. The control panel was a hollow box, the wiring harness was gone, and the oven cavity sat cold and empty as a shed in February. The auctioneer almost skipped it. He listed it at the tail end of the day when the serious buyers had already loaded their trucks and driven home. Last item, folks. 1974 Bongard deck oven, commercial grade, 3 chambers, no heating system, no controls, no thermostat. Frames solid. Doors close. That's about all I can tell you. Somebody give me $50 for the steel. A salvage man in the back raised his paddle. 50, Dorothy said, then 180. The salvage man looked at her. He did the math in his head, what the steel was worth, what it would cost to haul it, whether this woman knew something he didn't. He decided she didn't and sat down. Nobody else moved. The auctioneer tapped his gavel and moved on. Dorothy Crane arranged to have the oven transported to the back of her property on Concession Road 7, outside of Hartley Falls, where it sat under a tarp next to her late mother's woodworking shed for the rest of that spring. People drove past on their way to the grain co-op. More than a few of them slowed down to look. Word got around the way word always gets around in a town of 4,000 people. Dorothy Crane bought a bread oven with no heating elements, the shell of a thing. Paid nearly $200 for scrap metal and a set of working hinges. Gerald Potts, who ran the only commercial bakery in Hartley Falls and had been running it since before Dorothy was born, heard about it at the Legion on a Thursday night. He set down his glass and laughed until the men next to him started laughing too, without even knowing why. What in the world is she going to bake in that? Air? Nobody had a good answer. Let me tell you about Dorothy Crane. Because what she installed in that gutted Bongard oven over the following winter is one of the most practical, stubborn, and quietly brilliant things anyone in Renfrew County had done in a generation. And it only makes sense if you understand the woman who did it. Dorothy was born in 1951 in Hartley Falls, the second daughter of a woman named Frances Nolan, who had come to the Ottawa Valley from Cape Breton in 1946 and spent 40 years doing 3 things with total commitment: raising children, keeping books for half the businesses in town, and baking bread. Frances was not a hobbyist baker. She was a woman who had learned to bake from her own mother during the Depression, when bread was not a pleasant thing to make on a Sunday afternoon, but a calculation. How much flour was left, how far it needed to stretch, what the family would eat if it didn't rise. Frances baked with that Depression-era precision her whole life, long after it stopped being necessary. She understood fermentation the way a farmer understands soil, not as chemistry but as a relationship you maintained over years. Her sourdough starter was 22 years old when Dorothy was born. It was 44 when Frances died. Frances didn't teach Dorothy to bake the way most mothers teach daughters to bake. She didn't measure by cups, she measured by feel and by judgment, holding the dough and reading it the way a mechanic listens to an engine. She could tell the temperature of a proving dough by pressing 2 fingers against it for 3 seconds. She understood crust development and crumb structure, the way a carpenter understands wood grain, not from a book, but from decades of handling the material and paying close attention to what it told her. Dorothy grew up watching. By 16, she was baking the weekly bread herself. By 20, she had her mother's instincts, which is different from her mother's knowledge and harder to pass down. Frances had one other thing she gave her daughter, and it mattered just as much as the bread. She had no patience for paying for things she could figure out herself. Frances Nolan kept every piece of equipment she had ever owned running through ingenuity and stubbornness. Her 1961 mixer had been rebuilt 3 times, with part sheet ordered from 2 different provinces, and modified on the kitchen table with a file and a set of pliers. Her proofer, a wooden cabinet with a light bulb and a water pan, built by her husband the year he died, still worked in 1989 because Frances understood it as a system, not an appliance, and treated every failing part as a problem to be solved rather than a reason to buy something new. "The store sells you what it already made," Frances told Dorothy once. watching her daughter try to fix a seized bearing in the mixer rather than replace the whole assembly. What you need and what they sell are rarely the same thing. Close enough to fool you, not close enough to satisfy you. Dorothy carried that with her. She was 38 years old when she stood at that auction, no longer the youngest woman in the room, but not yet old enough to stop wanting to build something from the ground up. She had been thinking about the oven for 2 years before she bought it. The idea had started when Frances was still alive in the last year of her mother's life, when Dorothy drove out to the farmhouse every second day, and they sat in the kitchen and talked while Frances rested. Frances had said, more than once, that the thing she wished she'd done differently was to sell her bread, not as a hobby, not at the church sale, properly, a real bakery, even a small one. But equipment was expensive, and the timing was never right, and then the timing stopped mattering. Dorothy hadn't forgotten that. After Frances died and the farmhouse was sold and the starter was transferred to a mason jar in Dorothy's own fridge, she started thinking in a practical way about what it would actually take. A commercial oven was the central problem. A new Bonguard deck oven cost somewhere between $12,000 and $18,000 depending on configuration. A used one in working condition still ran $4,000 to $6,000. Dorothy didn't have that kind of money and wasn't willing to borrow it, not for something that hadn't proven itself yet. What she had was her mother's way of thinking about problems. She knew that the heating system in a commercial deck oven was, at its core, a set of electrical resistance elements, a thermostat, a controller, and some wiring. She knew that those components could be sourced separately. She knew that the Bonguard frame, triple-chamber, cast deck, 200 kilos of steel and ceramic, was the part that couldn't be replicated cheaply. The heat source could be engineered around. The frame could not. So when the gutted Bonguard appeared at the Hartley Falls municipal auction, stripped of everything but its bones, Dorothy recognized it for what it was, the hard part, available for the cost of scrap metal. She paid $180. Now she needed to make it work. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because what Dorothy did in her mother's woodworking shed over the winter of 1989 to 1990 was methodical and exact in the way that all good practical work is exact. Not dramatic, not fast, but deeply, quietly competent. The original heating system was gone entirely. What remained was the frame, the cast ceramic deck surfaces, the door hinges, the door seals, cracked in 2 places but repairable, and the flue connection at the back. Dorothy made a list of what she needed to understand before she touched anything. She drove to the Ottawa Public Library on a Tuesday and spent 4 hours reading through commercial food service equipment manuals. She found a service manual for an earlier Bonguard model at an equipment dealer in Nepean, who sold it to her for $3 because he couldn't imagine anyone needing it. She corresponded with a retired electrician in Pembroke named Art Schell, who had spent 20 years servicing commercial kitchen equipment and was willing to answer questions by letter, which he did, with remarkable patience over the course of 6 weeks. What Dorothy learned was that the heating element configuration in a deck oven was straightforward in principle. The challenge was sourcing elements to fit the existing deck dimensions. Replacement Bonguard elements were available through a Quebec distributor, but the price was steep and the lead time was long. Dorothy measured her deck chambers precisely, length, width, spacing, from the deck surface, and wrote to 3 industrial heating element manufacturers in Ontario asking whether custom elements could be wound to those dimensions. 2 wrote back. 1 quoted her a price she couldn't afford. The second, a small operation in Hamilton run by a man named Ray Fenwick, asked for her measurements and came back with a number she could manage. He also told her, without being asked, that if she could be flexible on the watt density, he could use a standard resistance wire that would bring the cost down further. She was flexible. She sourced a commercial thermostat and the simple relay controller from an electrical supply house in Renfrew. She bought new ceramic insulation to repack the door seals. She found replacement door gasket material at an industrial supply in Arnprior. The wiring she did herself, following Art Schell's diagrams and checking her work 3 times before she connected anything to power. Art had told her, the element connections are the only place you can't afford to be approximate. Everything else you can adjust. Get those wrong and you'll know immediately, and not in a way you'll enjoy. She got them right. The control panel she built from a steel project box, a rotary thermostat knob, an indicator light, and a toggle switch for each chamber. It looked nothing like the original Bongard panel. It looked like something a careful, practical person had built from what was available, which is exactly what it was. It worked on the first test, in February of 1990, when Dorothy set a proving dough inside the cold oven to see whether the temperature held, and found that it held within 2 degrees across the full width of the deck. She baked a test loaf the following morning. The crust came out the way her mother's crust came out, the sound when you tap the bottom. That particular hollow knock that meant the structure had set properly all the way through. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table in her mother's shed and ate a piece of that bread with butter, alone, in February, in the cold Ottawa Valley morning. She didn't call anyone. She just sat there and knew what she had. The neighbors noticed in April, when the shed started venting warm air in the mornings, and the smell of baking bread carried down Concession Road 7 in a way that was difficult to ignore. Dorothy had started baking to sell. Not a bakery, not yet, but a modest weekly production. 12 loaves on Thursday, 12 on Saturday, sold the families in Hartley Falls who'd heard through the same network that had once carried the news of her foolish purchase. The same people who'd heard about the gutted oven were now hearing about the bread. By June, she had a waiting list. Gerald Potts heard about the waiting list at the Legion, same as he'd heard everything else. He didn't laugh this time. A waiting list was a different kind of news than a broken oven. A waiting list meant Dorothy Crane had customers he didn't have, buying bread he wasn't selling. He drove out to Concession Road 7 on a Saturday morning under the pretext of being in the neighborhood, which fooled nobody and wasn't meant to. Dorothy was loading a cooling rack when he pulled in. Gerald got out of his truck and looked at the shed, at the improvised ventilation, at the stack of flour bags against the south wall. Then he looked at the oven through the open door. "That's a Bongard deck," he said. Dorothy confirmed that it was. "I heard it had no heating system when you bought it." She told him what she paid. She told him what the elements had cost and where she'd found them. She told him about Art Shell's letters and Ray Fenwick's wire specifications and the project box control panel that held temperature within 2 degrees. Gerald Potts was 61 years old and had been in the commercial baking business since he was 19. He walked over to the oven and looked at the control panel the way a man looks at something he understands well enough to judge properly. He checked the door seal, keys to the wiring runs along the interior wall. He was quiet for a while. "That's clean work," he said finally. "The thermostat placement. That's where you want it, center of the middle chamber. Most people put it too close to the element and get a false reading. Where'd you learn that?" "Art Shell," she told him. "Art Shell's a good man. Haven't thought about art in years." Gerald walked around the oven again. He looked at the deck surfaces, the cast ceramic that cost more than everything Dorothy had spent on the rebuild. "You paid $180 for the frame." "That's right." "The frame is the oven," he said. "Not the elements, not the controller. The thermal mass, the deck surface, the door geometry, that's what a deck oven is. Everything else is just switching heat on and off." He wasn't saying it to flatter her. He was saying it because it was true, and he'd never quite articulated it that way before, and saying it out loud while standing in front of a stripped oven that a 38-year-old woman had rebuilt in her mother's shed for what a decent controller normally cost alone. Saying it in that context made it land differently than it would have in a classroom. "You figured out the same thing I knew in theory for 40 years and never thought through properly," Gerald said. Dorothy didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to say. Gerald bought 2 loaves and drove home. He told his son-in-law about the visit that evening. His son-in-law, Martin, who managed the bakery's accounts and had been after Gerald for 3 years to upgrade to a newer oven, asked how the bread was. Gerald cut a slice and handed it to him without saying anything. Martin ate it. He didn't say anything either for a moment. "That's a very good loaf," Martin said. "It is," Gerald said. They finished the bread, and Gerald went to bed, and in the morning he called Dorothy and asked whether she wanted to talk about a wholesale arrangement. She did. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the oven on Concession Road 7 was not an ending. It was Dorothy Crane's way of beginning, the same way her mother's way of thinking about machines and problems had always been a starting point rather than a final answer. The wholesale arrangement with Gerald's bakery started small, 24 loaves a week, delivered Thursday mornings. Dorothy priced them slightly below what Gerald would have paid a commercial distributor, but above what she'd have gotten at a farmer's market. Gerald marked them up modestly and sold them under a house label because his customers wouldn't have known Dorothy's name. Dorothy didn't mind. The margin was what mattered. She kept her costs where she'd always kept them low. The oven had no payments. The shed had no payments. The starter culture was 26 years old and asked nothing but flour and water. She bought grain from 2 farms in Renfrew County, paying slightly over commodity price in exchange for consistent quality and early harvest access. The flour she milled herself in the 2nd year, after she found a stone mill at an estate sale in Eganville for $400 and spent a month learning how to dress the stones. The mill meant she could bake from whole grain without buying pre-processed flour. It reduced her cost per loaf by somewhere between 30 and 40 cents. On 200 loaves a week, that was $60 to $80. In a year, that was more than $3,000, which was not nothing. Dorothy kept the accounts the way her mother had kept accounts for other people's businesses. Precisely, without sentiment, in a hardcover notebook with columns, revenue in one column, costs in another, the difference in a third. She looked at the 3rd column every Sunday evening and knew exactly where she stood. By 1993, she was producing 400 loaves a week and had hired one person part-time, a young woman named Sylvie, who had grown up in the next township and wanted to learn to bake. Dorothy paid her fairly and taught her everything, the same way Frances had taught Dorothy, not by explanation first, but by proximity, by watching what happened when you did things right and what happened when you didn't. By 1995, the shed had been replaced by a proper bakehouse, built on the same concrete foundation by a local contractor Dorothy had known for 20 years. She paid for it in cash, in stages, as sections were completed. She didn't borrow. The bakehouse cost $42,000 over 18 months. She paid it the same way she'd paid for the oven and the mill, and every piece of equipment she'd added, slowly, completely, without interest. Gerald Potts retired in 1997. His son-in-law Martin took over the bakery and expanded the wholesale relationship with Dorothy. Martin was younger and thought differently about sourcing and branding, and he suggested with genuine respect and some hesitation that they put Dorothy's name on the label. She thought about it. She said yes. Crane's bread appeared in Hartley Falls and 4 neighboring towns under that label, beginning in 1998. It was not a large operation. Dorothy was not interested in becoming large. She was interested in being sound, in producing bread she was proud of, at a cost she could control, sold at a price that made the thing viable for as long as she wanted to keep doing it. The oven on Concession Road 7 was still running. Dorothy had replaced the elements twice since 1990, which was normal wear. The Bongard frame was unchanged. The ceramic deck surfaces, which were the heart of the thing, the thermal mass that produced the crust her mother would have recognized, had not changed at all. Cast ceramic doesn't wear the way metal wears. The frame Dorothy had bought for $180 at a municipal auction had now baked somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 loaves. She didn't advertise that number, but she knew it. Gerald came back through town in 2001, 4 years into his retirement, visiting his daughter and Martin and the grandchildren. He stopped by the bakehouse on a Tuesday afternoon, and Dorothy gave him a tour of what had grown up around the Bongard that he remembered. He looked at the mill. He looked at the grain storage. He looked at the updated proofer setup, 2 chambers now instead of 1. He looked at the accounts notebook sitting open on the side table. Dorothy wasn't bothered by people seeing her numbers. There was nothing in them to be ashamed of. "You built a real thing here," Gerald said. Dorothy said she supposed she had. "I've been thinking, since I retired, about the difference between the 2 kinds of people in this business." Gerald turned away from the notebook and looked at the oven, the old Bongard with the project box control panel that was now 15 years old and still holding temperature within 2 degrees. The ones who see equipment as something you buy, and the ones who see it as something you build. The buyers always have the newer machines. The builders always have the better margins. I spent 40 years being a buyer because I had the capital and the credit. You didn't have either, so you built, and now your business is paid for, and mine was sold. "That's one way to look at it," Dorothy said. "What's another way?" "Your bread was fine," Dorothy said. "I'm not in competition with what you built. I'm in continuation of what my mother started." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Frances would have liked this bakehouse. She would have hated what I paid the contractor, Dorothy said, and Gerald laughed, the real kind of laugh, not the one he'd been doing at the Legion in 1989. Let me ask you to sit with something for a moment. When Dorothy Crane stood at that municipal auction in the spring of 1989, she was looking at the same object as everyone else in that room. The salvage man saw scrap steel at $50. Gerald Potts, had he been there, would have seen a broken machine not worth the trouble. The auctioneer saw something he wanted off his list before lunch. Dorothy Crane saw the part of the oven that can't be bought cheaply. The cast deck, the thermal mass, the door geometry that took Bongard's engineers decades of refinement to get right. She saw that every other component, the elements, the controller, the wiring, the panel, was just heat and electricity and could be figured out by a person willing to write letters and read manuals and spend a winter in a cold shed paying close attention. She saw her mother's voice. A store sells you what it already made. She saw that the distance between a gutted frame and a working oven was not money. It was knowledge, patience, and the willingness to solve a problem rather than buy your way around it. Dorothy Crane built a bakery from a broken oven, a flour mill from an estate sale, a business from a sourdough culture that was older than her eldest child, and a reputation from bread that tasted like someone had been thinking about it their whole life. The Bongard frame cost $180, accounting for everything: elements, controller, wiring, gaskets, insulation. The working oven cost just under $400 total. Gerald Potts' entry-level replacement would have been $14,000. She baked 500,000 loaves in that oven. She paid for a $42,000 bakehouse in cash. She put her name on the label when she was ready and not before. They laughed in 1989 when she loaded a gutted oven onto a flatbed at a municipal auction. What she put inside it was her mother's starter, her mother's knowledge, and the understanding that a broken thing is only finished if the person looking at it decides it is. $180, a winter and a cold shed. Everything else was bread. I keep thinking about that image. A gutted oven sitting under a tarp on Concession Road 7 through an entire Ottawa Valley winter, and a woman who looked at it every morning knowing exactly what it was going to become. Most people need to see the finished thing before they believe in it. Dorothy didn't work that way. She had already done the calculation before she raised her hand at that auction. The frame was sound. The rest was solvable. That's not luck or instinct. That's what happens when someone has spent a lifetime being taught to look at problems honestly instead of looking away from them. There's a word for that kind of clear-eyed thinking, and it's not cleverness. Frances Nolan didn't raise a clever daughter. She raised a daughter who understood the difference between what a thing costs and what a thing is worth, and who had the patience to hold that distinction steady even when everyone around her was laughing. That kind of understanding, the real slow-built kind, comes from years of watching someone you trust apply it over and over, in small situations and large ones, until it becomes the only way you know how to see. What strikes me most about Dorothy's story is not the oven itself. It's the sequence of choices that made the oven possible. She didn't borrow. She didn't rush. She wrote letters to a retired electrician in Pembroke and waited for his answers. She measured twice and wired once and checked her work 3 times before she connected anything to power. That's not the behavior of someone chasing a result. That's the behavior of someone who has decided that doing the thing right matters more than doing it fast. There's a kind of moral seriousness in that, the refusal to cut a corner because the corner is tempting and no one would notice. Dorothy would have noticed. And then there's what she did with what she built. She didn't scale recklessly. She didn't take on debt the moment the first loaf sold. She added the mill when she could afford it, built the bakehouse in stages and paid each stage in full, hired Sylvie and taught her everything she knew. Every decision she made carried the same weight as the original one at the auction. What is this actually worth? What can I actually afford? And what am I willing to build rather than buy? The results followed the decisions. That's the only way results ever follow anything. The $180 oven baked $500,000 loaves. The zero-debt bakehouse outlasted the financed one down the road. The sourdough starter Frances had kept alive since the Depression was still feeding families in Renfrew County 40 years later because someone had the discipline to tend it every single day without being asked. I think about Frances saying that a store sells you what it already made. What you need and what they sell are rarely the same thing. That's not a cynical statement. It's an invitation. It's Frances telling her daughter, and anyone else willing to listen, that the gap between what exists and what you actually need is not a problem. It's where the work is. It's where the interesting part of a life gets built. Dorothy Crane found that gap in a gutted Bonguard oven at a municipal auction and spent the next 30 years filling it, one loaf at a time.